Hi everyone. Okay, so welcome to the panel 2, and I hope you enjoyed your mini tea break. My name is Chervin Lam. As you can see, I am from Purdue University, but in a few days' time I'll be an NUS student, so hello from both sides. Okay. So I will be presenting the Health Communication Advocacy tool. Just to get you up to speed with what health advocacy is. Okay? Health advocacy, I define it as any effort to change or improve health policies. Okay, so for example, did you know that the airplanes that you ride on, they were not smoke-free years ago? So in the 1970s, people could smoke a cigar at your face for hours. So after years, about 20 to 30 years of health advocacy campaigns, we get to enjoy the smoke-free flights that we enjoy today. Okay? So that's an example. And during my time at Purdue, I co-authored a book with my professor, Mary-Fran Madsen. She came up with this idea of health communication advocacy tool. So I just want to say that this is her idea. If you don't like the idea, go look for her. Okay? But if you like it, that is great. Okay, thanks. So this is how the tool looks like. Okay, it's clustered right now. I don't expect to discuss it like that. I'll take each phase out and I'll just discuss it accordingly. Okay, so there are 3 phases, all right? And using this tool, you could guide someone through an advocacy campaign. Okay, so if you want to advocate for a health issue, you could use this tool for such a purpose, all right? There have been certain approaches and methodologies for health advocacy, but usually they come from other fields, not in communication, especially in political science. All right, so I'd like to introduce to you this tool which really emphasizes on communication processes and strategies. Okay, and you could see that really in phase 2. Right, so let's proceed with phase 1. So before you go embark on a campaign, you need to convene a team, right? So I've identified 4 key members in your team. First, we have health issue experts. I define health issue experts as people who are familiar with a health issue. So for example, if you want to advocate for cancer, right? This might be cancer doctors or especially patients. Okay, so if you were here with us yesterday, Dr. Mohan Dutta was giving this brilliant speech, and he was saying how we should think about what the people feel, right? So we shouldn't just push our agendas on people, but we should listen to the people and then bring it to the people at the status quo. Okay, so we should listen to cancer patients, what their struggles are, and then from there go forward with our advocacy campaign. Okay, so health issue experts. Community partners are people who are grassroots organizations, for example, churches or social welfare organizations, okay? Because we need to disseminate advocacy messages, and grassroots organizations, they are very effective in disseminating messages, okay? Then we have public health communication specialists. They are us, people who are in the academe communication specialists. We contribute by telling them, hey, how should we best craft messages so that we could persuade policymakers, all right? And then finally, there's the lobbyists. It's not very prominent there's no lobbying in Singapore, but lobbyists in US is a big thing, okay? They are people, paid professionals who would apply pressure on policymakers, and they would talk to policymakers, okay? So maybe a thing that you could think about is, why don't we have lobbying in Singapore, right? And so as communication scholars, that might be something to consider. Then phase 2. Okay, once you have convened your team, you got to agree on an advocacy goal. So for example, if you want to advocate for cancer care, right? If you think that, cancer care is so expensive, I want to make it affordable, right? So you want to change policy. You want to say insurance should cover cancer care. So that is your advocacy goal. Your team has to agree on it, and then you got to craft messages for your advocacy goal, right? And so this is phase 2. When you craft a message, you need to consider who are you crafting the messages for, right? There are 3 key audiences for advocacy. They are the legislators, the policymakers, the relevant populations, people who are affected by the health issue, for example, cancer patients, right? And the media. Why do you need to communicate to the media? Because you could use free social media applications, but there are some media that are not free. For example, TV broadcasting, newspaper organizations, the radio. You need to convince these media organizations that, hey, I have an important advocacy campaign and I want you to broadcast it to the public. Okay, so these are the three audiences that you need to craft your messages accordingly to. Okay, so you need to do formative research. You need to identify what their needs are. You need to think about, do they know the health issue? Do they know that cancer care is affordable, unaffordable, right? And so you need to do formative research. If you recall, Dr. Mohan Dutta was saying yesterday that, oh, you can't just talk to people for 3 days and you understand their needs, right? And so that's really why you need health issue experts. You need people like cancer patients to have partnership with. You need community partners to have partnership with and to know what are the needs and concerns that they have, okay? So after you've identified these three main audiences, that's when you craft your message, okay? You craft your message to be as persuasive as possible. There are many, many kind of strategies you can use, but I've identified 5 very popular ones, okay? So your messages have to be stimulating, right? You could do that in many ways. You could use emotional appeals, right? Emotional appeals, we're very familiar with that. There's guilt, anger appeals. Anger appeal is a very useful method, especially for social justice issues, right? If you say that, oh, cancer care is not affordable, they didn't bring this up upon themselves. Why are they? Why do they have to pay so much for something that, they don't deserve this, right? If your audiences see that, they'll be like, oh yeah, I'm kind of angry. Why is that such injustice, right? And so this is a good way to get people moving, right? Your messages have to be motivational as well. So we know the whole threat, the self-efficacy thing, right? So your messages have to indicate how is the issue threatening to your audiences, right? How is cancer care relevant for me, right? So you got to tell them how this is relevant to them and how they can address the issue, right? Don't just tell them, oh, it's how cancer care is unaffordable, but how do you address that, right? So in your messages, you have to consider that as well. Your messages also have to eliminate barriers. So for example, in Singapore, people might think that, oh, wow, advocacy campaign, if I support it, would I be seen as a protester, right? Like someone who's rioting. So you need to tell them, no, you're not protesting. This is a good cause, right? So you need to eliminate barriers. It also has to be culturally consistent, something that Mohan Dutta likes to talk about. You need to look at the individual and their needs and what kind of messages appeal to them most, okay? And finally, your messages must be resource contingent, all right? It usually is kind of expensive to go through an advocacy campaign. We're looking at about 30 to 50 grand easily because hiring a lobbyist is pretty expensive. My professor, she did a campaign and she hired a lobbyist. She had to pay 20 grand for just one-time service, so it's pretty expensive. So you need to consider, okay, what channels am I going to use? Am I going to use advertising, and do I have the budget for it, right? And so that's how you create a persuasive message. Besides that, you have also to think about how you're going to market the message. So that's where marketing mix comes in. Marketing mix is a combination of marketing and social science, all right? So they have this popular 4 Ps: product, promotion, placement, and price. Okay, so I'll just run real quick each one. Your messages, you need to think about what is your product, okay? The product is the advocacy goal, all right? So you need to be clear what is your advocacy goal. Your messages must be clear what that is, all right? Like that? It's worse. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So, product. So you need to be clear what your advocacy goal is when you craft your message, okay? Just to give you an example of what is a not clear product, I saw a banner recently, a few days ago, a huge banner, right? And there was one picture of a dying flower and it says, oh, this is what happens when there's not enough sunlight. And on the other side was another picture of a blooming flower, and that's a flower with much sunlight. And I had no idea what the product was. So there was just this banner. And I was on the escalator, I was going down, and so I was struggling to see what product that was. And I saw like in a fine print, there was an advertising company that said, oh, you need to have the right location and the right expertise to advertise well. So I found, oh, okay, so it was an advertising company, which was kind of ironic because they didn't advertise well. So this is an example of poor advertising. You don't show your product well, right? So you need to think about how to make it clear that this is your advocacy goal. Promotion. Promotion is how are you going to promote your advocacy message, right? You have a persuasive message, but how are you going to promote it? What channel are you going to use, okay? There's some research that shows that social media is not really good for advocacy campaigns because they don't really translate into real support. For example, the UN in Sweden, they have this campaign that's called Likes Don't Save Lives. Okay, that's on Facebook because a lot of the likes on Facebook don't really turn into real support. Okay, so there was this fundraiser. They had 3 million likes, but they only raised about $20,000. So you could see it doesn't translate into real support. So promotion, which channel are you going to use? That's something you've got to consider. Placement. Placement is how are your supporters going to support the campaign, right? Don't just tell them, oh, this is the advocacy goal, because it's just awareness. You need to tell them where do they go to. Do they sign a petition? Do they go online? Do they give you money? Right? You got to be clear about that. And finally, we have price. Okay, what is the cost for supporting the campaign? Do they do donations? What about the stress involved? Are there any burdens, right? Because privacy issues, will my name be mentioned? Things like that. You need to tell them, is there any price involved? And so that we have in our messaging process is about crafting a good message, and marketing mix is how do you market that good message, all right? And so once your message is done, you got to pre-test the message, okay? Just to test whether it works with a group of people, okay? And if you feel that it doesn't work, then fine-tune it. If it works, go ahead and disseminate it, okay? So that's phase 3, disseminate the advocacy message. And if it works well, the policymakers say, okay, good, I'm convinced, I'm sold. That's when you inform those people who are affected by the policy change. So for example, if cancer care is more affordable now, inform those who are affected by cancer. Say, hey, there's this new policy change, and if there's a way to go about it, tell them how to go about it. Like, do I buy an insurance package for this new policy change, right? And if your message doesn't work, you go through a correction loop. You go back to phase 2. You go back to message development again, where you have to fine-tune your message again, okay? So what aspects of your message did not work, you go fine-tune it. What aspects worked well, let it stay, right? And then you just go through this cycle of disseminating and fine-tuning your messages until policy changes, all right? So that's pretty much it. I'll just leave you with an example of something that really worked, okay? My professor, Mary Madsen, she went through an advocacy campaign herself, and she used the very same tool, okay? So it's a tried and tested tool, it works. So she assembled her team, and they went about advocating for prosthetic parity. So Mary Fan, she is an amputee, so she has a prosthetic leg. She found out that prosthetic limbs are actually pretty expensive. She had a computerized version, which was pretty neat. It helps her with balancing. But what about people who cannot afford computerized prosthetic limbs? So that was a concern. And she found out that most people could not afford prosthetic limbs. And so she used this campaign, and they went about crafting the messages, and they disseminated the messages. And in fact, in the end, policy did change. Prosthetic parity became the new law in Indiana, and people could afford prosthetic limbs. Basically, their messages were kind of drastic. They did a rally, and they were broadcasted on TV. And they did it in the winter, amputees in the winter holding signboards. And so if that's on TV, policymakers have to do something. So that was what they did, and they succeeded. So I'll leave you with a thought, like what are some health advocacy issues that you could probably carry out? What about cancer care in Singapore? What about insurance in US? I did some research with some cancer patients, and I found out that some hospitals don't accept certain insurance, which I found it pretty startling. So that is a campaign that you might want to carry out in the future. And if you do, I hope that you use the health communication advocacy too. So thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. This is actually like a homecoming for me because I'm an alumna of NUS. I have a master's degree in CNM. My presentation is on transnational migration, and there are several important issues surrounding transnational migrant workers that are prime for research, policy, and advocacy, such as poverty, illegal recruitment, human trafficking, abuse, safety, health, security, investments, citizenship, repatriation, family reunification, family life, and my own research area, transnational families. The paper that I will be presenting is like a synthesis of what I have been doing so far with respect to Filipino transnational migration and family communication. It is also my initial attempt to address the conscientizing question, so now what? So I'm here to present what we could possibly initiate as communication scholars and or what we could possibly pursue as communication advocates with respect to safeguarding the well-being of transnational families. The continuously increasing number of Filipinos who are leaving their homes and families for overseas employment is consequently generating a growing number of Filipino transnational families. Given that parents comprise a substantial number of Filipino migrant workers, a significant volume of Filipino children is left at home without one or both parents because of itinerant work. Official statistics report that over 10 million Filipino children are left behind and their parent, one or both of their parents are working overseas. So while international labor migration serves as a relatively lucrative solution for families who need a comparatively higher wage of overseas employment, extant literature documents that international migration generates psychosocial strains to transnational family members. For instance, overseas Filipino workers experience psychosocial distresses as absentee spouses and parents, while their families back home experience psychosocial burdens as left behind spouses, left behind children, and caregivers. So there has been a growing concern on how labor migration-led family separation has been affecting the well-being of Filipino transnational families. In this afternoon session, I will present my analysis of the micro and macro level challenges of transnational separation of overseas Filipino worker parents and their left behind children. For my analysis, I have drawn evidence from existing literature on Filipino transnational parents and families, including my own research papers on Filipino transnational mothers. Furthermore, I will put forward a communication policy advocacy proposal that highlights the critical role of communication in facilitating a better life for transnational families. The goal is to safeguard the well-being of transnational families, which covers both objective and subjective dimensions such as physiological, psychological, economic, social, spiritual, and however else the family would want to define well-being. It could also include their state of happiness, their state of satisfaction, so it's the whole range. Since this is a forum on communication for social change, the question is, as communication scholars and advocates, how could we harness the potential of communication for the well-being of transnational families? Based on my review of literature, based on my interviews of transnational migrant mothers, as far as communication is concerned, I am proposing that safeguarding the well-being of transnational families should incorporate two levels of concerns. First, the micro level or family level. At the micro level or family level, the concern is with the family's temporal and spatial separation. And the resolution is to compress time and space, and this is based on my lit review and interview of migrant mothers. They can compress time and space by managing family intimacy through mediated family communication. Now, at the level At the macro or societal level, the concern is society's prescription of the quote-unquote right kind of family. The resolution is to reconstruct the concept of family by reconfiguring prescribed family roles and responsibilities through societal communication. Let's first discuss the micro-level challenges of transnational separation of parents and children. With respect to micro-level, the concern is the family's temporal and spatial separation. Logically, the daily routines of family intimacy are easier carried out when family members spend time together and they share space. The resolution at the micro or family level is to compress time and space. Fortunately, the growth in the number of transnational families transpired alongside groundbreaking developments in communication media and technologies. Contemporary communication media and technologies compress time and space, you all know this, allowing perpetual contact among family members. Next, how could we harness communication at the family level to address micro-level challenges of transnational separation? With respect to communication, the operational plan is to manage family intimacy. The newer forms, again, we all know this, of communication media and technologies allow transnational family members to sustain family life and maintain effective ties anytime, anywhere, and at more affordable rates. The advent of mobile phones in particular changed the communication landscape of transnational families. I'll now share with you some anecdotes from my interviews of Singapore-based migrant mothers. One mother shared, "When my daughter got sick, I advised her to take herbal remedy and I called every 30 minutes to ask how she was feeling because it's relatively cheap to make phone calls now." Another mother narrated, "When my daughter was about to enter college, we often talked about the courses that she could possibly take. I gave her advice, but I let her decide." Another mother narrated, "I am friends with my daughter, so she's comfortable in talking to me about the guys courting her. Since I get information directly from her, I have the opportunity to guide her on her initiation to romance." So mothers tend to befriend their children so that they can get gossip about their children's romantic relationship. And then another mother said, "Even if I'm living apart from my children, it's like I'm still there." This is a recurring sentiment. In fact, as early as 1997, a study by Honte News Sotelo and Avila quoted one migrant mother in their study, and that migrant mother said, "I'm here, but I'm there." So the plan of managing intimacy may be enacted through mediated family communication. Based on my review of excellent literature and my own study of transnational mothers, there appears to be a marked contrast in the transnational parenting that migrant fathers and mothers carry out. This is mainly because even during migration, Filipino transnational fathers and transnational mothers enact their culturally prescribed roles. When migrant fathers do communicate with their children, they tend to neglect the emotional aspect of sustaining their father-child relationship. Rosel Pareñas is a Filipino sociologist doing Filipino transnational migration studies. And she wrote, "Perhaps because no social expectation to do so is imposed on fathers, migrant fathers rarely communicated with their children." So fathers tend to communicate with their wife because their concern mainly is about financial management. So when they talk to their children, they even tend to discipline their children, to nag them when there are concerns about their schooling, their grades, or whatever concerns the children. So the authoritarianism of the father is still present even when the father is living apart from the children. With respect to migrant mothers, Pareñas noted that in contrast to the sporadic communication that embodies relations between migrant men and their children, migrant mothers are ever present in the lives of their children. One mother in my research said, "I exercise caution when I discipline my child." So unlike fathers who tend to be authoritarian, mothers tend to be more nurturing even when they discipline. So the mother continued, "I make sure that my child understands where I'm coming from to avoid any untoward misunderstandings." Another mother explained, "We're already living apart, so I don't want to create any emotional distance between us." And then mothers also consciously strive to sustain emotional ties with their children. One mother shared, "Before we end our phone call, we keep on saying, 'I love you, I miss you,' repeatedly, without us knowing that we have already spent 2 to 3 minutes just doing so." So as one mother uttered, "It's hard. So this is recurring. But through communication, I can still be a mother to them. So my conversations with migrant mothers and my review of studies on Filipino transnational parents confirm that communication is an integral part of transnational parenting. While mediated parenting has limitations, it's not perfect, it is the best response to the situation imposed by transnational labor migration. Now let me present to you the macro level. Again, the macro level pertains to societal level concern, resolution, operational plan, and enactment. Again, this is based on my review of literature and my conversations with migrant mothers. At the macro level, the concern is linked with society's prescription of, quote-unquote, the right kind of family. Society's prescription is rooted on its steadfast adherence to traditional gendered norms. Fathers are generally regarded as the family's authority figure. So they're socially constructed as the pillar of the home, or in Filipino, haligi ng tahanan, a metaphor that reinforces their stereotypical image of power and asserts their so-called masculinity. So Filipino fathers are expected to be the authority, they are expected to perform productive work, they are supposed to maintain order and discipline in the household. Whereas Filipino mothers are socially constructed as the light of the home, or in Filipino, ilaw ng tahanan, a metaphor that reaffirms their stereotypical image of warmth and supports their so-called femininity. As mothers are the primary caregivers, they are culturally expected to prioritize caring for the home and the well-being of the family. Thus, even when society has embraced working mothers, it is still circumspect when it comes to the mother's ability to juggle her responsibilities at home and at work. Now, operationalizing transnational parenting within the gendered parenting framework consequently leads to psychosocial distresses among the members of transnational families. Transnational families are not only coping with the anxiety of transnational separation, but they also have to deal with their dissonance with a culturally prescribed notion of the quote-unquote right kind of family. Moreover, migrant parents carry the burden of functioning within the mold of the right kind of fathering and the right kind of mothering, even when they're living apart from their children. In Rosal Pareñas' interview of Left Behind Children of Migrant Fathers, she found that most children feel the strains of the gap between fathers and children, a gap aggravated by the minimal length of time that families spend together, as well as the authoritarianism of fathers. Because when fathers again communicate with their children, they tend to discipline them. Meanwhile, in Pareñas' interview of Left Behind Children of Migrant Mothers, she found that for children left behind in the Philippines, staying together and keeping the family whole are worth much more than achieving material security. The binary construction of money versus family suggests that children consider this to be mutually exclusive decision for mothers. Moreover, an underlying suggestion is the wrongful decision of mothers for having chosen money instead of family. So in my own interview of Singapore-based migrant mothers, one mother uttered, "That's the curse of a mother working abroad. You're a mother financially, but you're not a mother physically." Another mother lamented, "Sometimes I feel like I'm a failure as a mother because I'm not with them. But what choice do I have?" Thus, in order to help ease the psychosocial distresses of transnational families, there is a pressing need for society to reconstruct its concept of family and to reconfigure its prescribed family roles and responsibilities. It is therefore necessary to orient society through societal communication. So how do we harness communication? As far as communication is concerned, the plan is to reconfigure family roles and responsibilities. In the case of migrant fathers, notions of the right kind of father creates artificial boundaries between what they can actually do as parents and what society deems as gender appropriate. Fathers can do much more than assert their authority and discipline their children. Hence, Pareñas encouraged fathers to cross socially constructed gender boundaries to ease the emotional tensions that their transnational separation generates. Now, while the notions of the right kind of father imposes arbitrary limits on migrant fathers' parenting, the notions of the right kind of mothering constructs good mothering as a balancing act between a migrant mother's traditionally prescribed reproductive function and her recently expanded productive function. Thus, migrant mothers have to carry out their reproductive duties off-site alongside their productive contribution to the household, thereby perpetuating women's multiple burden, even in a setting such as transnational family setting. Hence, men's role at home should be expanded beyond traditional notions of gender responsibilities. The plan for reconfiguring prescribed family roles and responsibilities may be enacted through societal communication. In particular, while it is imperative to break gendered family role expectations, it is now even more urgent and critical as more and more families experience family-led separation. Okay, quickly. In order to help transnational parents and families manage the micro and macro level challenges of transnational family separation, I am putting forward a communication policy advocacy proposal that highlights the critical role of communication in facilitating a better life for transnational families. I categorized my proposal into two sections. The first section attempts to address the micro level challenges, while the second section attempts to address the macro level challenges. First, macro level. At the micro level, my policy advocacy proposal harnesses communication as a means for managing family communication. So it centers on family communication, which would help address the psychosocial challenges of transnational families' spatial and temporal separation. My advocacy particularly seeks to spread awareness and appreciation of the importance of family communication, especially among transnational family members, to develop the skills of transnational family members in using communication to maintain and sustain family life across borders, and to widen transnational family members' access to affordable media and technologies for long-distance contact. Addressing the micro-level advocacy objectives entails dividing the communication strategy into four phases. The first phase targets the church, the Philippine Roman Catholic Church, that is, as an interest group and agenda setter. I'm targeting the Philippine Roman Catholic Church because about 80% of Filipinos are Roman Catholics. So the goal is for the church to be a staunch advocate of family communication, and for the church to come up with position papers, pastoral letters on the importance of family communication. Phase 2 targets Philippine media as agenda setter. The goal is for, hopefully, the Philippine media to develop media products that highlight the role of communication in living as a family, to develop a pool of media personalities who would champion family communication and to come up with a media policy that they would consciously promote family communication through their media products. Phase 3, the telcos. The goal is for telcos to offer a wide array of affordable media and technologies for transnational contact among transnational family members. And then phase 4 for the micro level, schools, local government units, civil society organizations, and the goal is for them to develop a pool of literacy trainers and to offer literacy training in using communication media and technologies for transnational contact. In terms of macro level, my policy advocacy harnesses communication as a means to reconstruct the concept of family and to reconfigure prescribed family roles and responsibilities, which would help address the psychosocial challenges of society's prescription of the right kind of family and advance the acceptability of transnational families. My advocacy specifically seeks to engender positive perception towards transnational families and to engender family values that transcend gender definition of family roles and responsibilities. Again, I have divided the strategy into 3 phases. This time, just covering the church, the media, and the schools. So, as in the long run, I dream that the option to work in the Philippines would be just as lucrative as working abroad, if not more. That's the dream. In the interim, however, overseas employment remains to be a more profitable option among many Filipino families. In some cases, it is even the only option. Given the reality that, at least for the interim, transnational separation would remain to be a reality among many Filipino families, again, the question is, what could we do as communication scholars and advocates to ease the psychosocial burdens of transnational families? I hope that my initial proposal would stimulate a discourse on how communication may be harnessed at the micro and macro level to safeguard the well-being of transnational families. I acknowledge the ambitiousness of my policy advocacy, the scale of work it requires, and the extent of resources it entails. However, I cannot simply ignore the evidence that I have gathered about the psychosocial burdens of transnational families and my subsequent analysis on how a micro and macro level communication policy advocacy could help make a difference in alleviating the distresses of transnational families in both family and societal levels. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is RJ Arellano. I used to be a faculty of the University of the Philippines. Currently, I'm now working with an international NGO in the Philippines. I'm the Communication and Advocacy Coordinator, so I'm so glad to be here. This conference emphasizing the importance of communication for social change. So this is like my going back to my 6 years of work in the academe, so it feels new again, and I'm really scared for my life. But I'll try my best to present to you a paper that is very close to me. I am a son of a domestic helper in Kuwait, and so this topic on the feminization of labor migration is very close to home. So you can see the bias in my paper already. And this is my negotiated reading of 2 films, mainstream films, may I say, so you'd know that the messages are from the dominant messages. So these are messages from the mainstream media, not from the independent, not from the OFWs themselves. But I'm going to present to you a negotiated reading of the Philippine cinema's discourse on the issue of feminization of labor migration. All right. Sorry. So the surge in number of Filipinos leaving the country to work abroad from just around 30,000 in 1981 to approximately 1.8 million registered immigrants in 2012 has considerably challenged our long-held social construct of women as properties of the home. Of course, particularly in the context of the Philippines. I will not be speaking in the context of other cultures in the countries. Now, with the exodus of thousands of mothers every year to seek greener pasture overseas, sociologists have been problematizing how this reshapes the domestic sphere where women's function have been traditionally essentialized. Without mama, who will look after the family, will papa be effective in taking care and performing his roles? How will those children left behind be affected? I think Ms. Rosella's answered and gave light to that. And more importantly, for this paper, how does mama cope as reimagined in Philippine cinema? So my paper aims to focus on the issue of feminization labor migration in the country, particularly on OFW mothers and their performance of motherhood. But I am specifically situating the discussion in the realm of the cinema, where ever since the hanging of Flora Contemplacion, whose travails were made public through intense news reportage and media reenactments of her life story, OFW issues are significantly drummed into the collective consciousness of the Filipino people's psyche. Film as a communication medium can be an effective medium and form of social commentary, particularly with the power of drama. As Francis Bacon noted, drama is moving, effective means by which philosophical and moral principles could be set before the eyes of rich and poor, educated and uneducated alike. I chose to textually analyze 2 popular Filipino films that tackle the plight of OFW mothers. One is entitled Anak, which was launched in 2000, and then the other one is entitled Caregiver, which was produced and screened in 2009, so it's like 10 years of gap. And produced by one very popular and giant production outfit in the Philippines called Stars Cinema. And then my paper wanted to point out how the concept or performance of mothering from a distance, as phrased by sociologist Pereñas, is reimagined through cinematic representation. By focusing on the mutuality of form, film, and content message, I intend to know how our social construction of motherhood are articulated, defined, or upheld by these portrayals against a backdrop of ongoing labor migration. So to give my inquiry a proper background, I am surveying first the history of women migration in the country. I'll try to be very brief and fast as much as possible, but there are lots of things that I wanted to say, but here goes. The persistence of globalization as a phenomenon in both economic and cultural terms has resulted in the increase of movement of people within and across national borders and cemented in our consciousness the term migration to refer to individuals moving as part of their effort to improve their lives and the lives of their families, to learn new skills, to gain new experience, to find a job, or to flee insecurity, disaster, or famine. Migration is an economic, social, and political process that affects those who move, those who stay behind, and the places where they go, according to the Department of International Development. So, Zlotnick in 2003 notes that the entry of women into migration, streams that had heretofore been primarily male, has been one of the most significant trends in migration. Today, about half of the migrants of the world are women, approximately 95 million, according to the International Labour Organization in 2005. This mobility of women has been noted to have significant impacts on the roles of both female and male migrants, the families left behind in the migration process, and the state of the source and destination communities and countries of migrants. In particular, migration of women within and from developing countries affects the development process itself for those countries. So historically, migration was largely a male undertaking. The prevailing pattern of international migration was the lone, rugged male who left his family behind in the homeland as he ventured across seas to seek his fortune, hoping to return to them after achieving success. However, particularly in the last 30 years, author Asis 2003 wrote that journeying in Asia has meant international labor migration, initially to the Gulf countries in the 1970s and to the dragon economies in Asia from the 1980s, and men were not the only ones taking part in the diaspora. She says, in the 1970s, Filipino men began availing themselves of job opportunities in the Gulf countries. The slowing down of infrastructure projects, the second oil crisis in 1979, and the changing labor needs of the Gulf countries resulted in a lower demand for male workers and an emerging need for female workers to fill the demand for medical personnel, maintenance workers, and domestic helpers. The Philippines was among the poorer countries where most female migrants have come from, along Indonesia and Sri Lanka for the past 2 decades. The percentage of legally deployed female migrants in these countries is estimated 60 to 80% every year. Legal migration from Indonesia and Sri Lanka is dominated by women who take up domestic work in Middle Eastern countries, with Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan as the other secondary destinations. So in the Philippines, in 2012, 55 to 60% of those who migrated for work were women, and mostly between the age of 22 to 40 years old. So according to the country migration report of IOM, it gets, the population gets younger and younger of these people who migrate for work. I would assume some of them are also children of overseas Filipino workers trying their luck abroad as well. So my paper is basically interested in the concepts of cultural identities and cinematic representations. I personally believe that films, and by portraying the overseas Filipino workers, in a way contribute to the creation of national identity. But national identity and identity itself is very fluid. It changes over time, and so does media and its role through cinematic representation. So nothing in the films that I'm going to present is fixed or essentialized, but this is how the media, mainstream media in the Philippines present the issue of the feminization of labor migration in the country. So theoretically, my analysis of the film is guided by the new economics of migration theory, gender and representation. So I'm just going to discuss briefly some of these theories. Just to review, the new economics of labor migration theory says that the starting point of this new approach is being represented by the idea that the immigration decision is not being made at an individual level, but rather along important human groups such as families or households. Before, it's believed that it's going abroad, working abroad is a personal decision. New economics of labor migration says it's not necessarily just individual. Families, members of the families are now involved in making a decision whether one part of the family should go abroad or not. And they have a concept called relative deprivation, where families compare themselves to other families. Reference groups compare themselves to other groups, and then they decide whether one member of the family should go abroad, maybe to to augment their income and so on and so forth. The members of these groups act in common not only to maximize their income but also to minimize their risk and overcome limitations occurred as a consequence of the failures of the national markets, not necessarily in the labor market. The other theory I'm using here is under media studies is the theory of representation by Stuart Hall, and he says that media is the site of the production of meaning. The production of meaning means that there is a kind of symbolic work, an activity, a practice which has to go on in giving meaning to things and in communicating that meaning to someone else. So there are signifying practices that happen in the creation of these images or messages in the media. And representation is under media studies, which is concentrated on the effects and the products of signifying practices with a carrying meaning, and that in our world happen to be widely circulated by the media being one of the most powerful and extensive systems for the circulation of meaning. And finally, gender as a performance. It's this concept by Judith Butler, who is a social constructivist. And she said that gender is not an essential category. The repetitious performances of male and female in accordance with social norms reifies the categories, creating the appearance of a naturalized or essential binary. Gender is never a stable descriptor of an individual, but an individual is always doing gender, performing or deviating from the socially accepted performance of gender stereotypes. So this is how this is the lens that I created theoretically and a framework in looking at women, migrant women in film as a cinematic text. That it is not, nothing there is fixed, but the discourse of Philippine cinema of women migrant workers and mothers is actually an overlapping of different discourses of migration, gender, and representation. So this is basically the theoretical framework of my my paper, and that's how my analysis is being guided by this framework. Okay, so now let me now introduce you to the films. These are very successful and pioneering films on OFW mothers in the Philippines. The first one is entitled Anak. The Tagalog translation is daughter or child. But I suppose in this sense the meaning is daughter. And then the other one is Caregiver. So 10 years gap between the two films, and still talks about the plight of OFW mothers in other countries. Let me just show you short trailers of the movies for you to have a little bit of understanding. They have no English subtitles, so I'm just going to explain later on. So how do I volume? Okay. Okay.
Yes, ma'am, everything is set. Starting next Monday, Mrs. Biglayan is taking over this class. I will go to London.
She makes fullest the pet of all the people there.
Wala po ka magpunta sa akin, ha? Huwag ka magagalit, ha? Kahit pag tumanda ka na, kung susunod sa akin, huwag kita, ha? Hey, gusto ko. Ano ka na?
Dito ka na. Magkakaroon ka na tayo.
Magtatrabaho ko ng maigi para mabilis lahat ng plano natin.
Welcome to Mother's Gate.
I assure you, sir, I'll do my very best.
Si Sarah, bago nating sister dito.
No, I want to be taking care of you for now. Open your mouth now, sweetheart.
Tayo may hanap buhay dito dahil hindi masigura ng mga pwedol yung dirty jobs natin.
Mga atras, kaya nandito ka na.
Ba't naman dito?
Eh, di ba ka lang yan?
Di ba ako? Saan ka na lang? Higa!
Eh, baka matagalan, laro natin makuha si Pao.
Yung makasweldo mo lang, mabibigta ka na.
Kung ako wala na dalawa sa kamatrabaho, alam mo na may pagkat tayo ng bansa, pero tayong dalawa ganito pa rin.
I'll call for you if and when I need you. Get out of my...
Okay, I only have 5 more minutes, so let me just skip to the actual paper itself. So I hope
I'm wrong. You can't stop.
So, okay, so Caregiver is a story about Sarah, a mother who left her son in the Philippines and also was a teacher who relinquished her profession in lieu of caregiving in London in hopes of augmenting her salary. More than just a chronicle of the Filipino experience working as a nurse and caregivers in the UK, the story also charts Sarah's journey to self-discovery. From a submissive wife who makes sacrifices to make way for her husband's aspirations to an empowered woman who finds dignity and pride in humbling job as a caregiver in London, according to Wikipedia. And then Anak, the other one, is the story is about a mother, also a mother, named Josie. One of the many residents of the archipelago is forced to leave her family and take a higher paying job in Hong Kong, a more prosperous Asian country. Like the plight of other maltreated domestic helpers, her employers refuse to let her take a vacation, nor do they deliver mail to her. She is unaware, therefore, that her husband has died. When she finally returns to the Philippines, she is met with resentment and hatred by her children, more particularly her eldest daughter. The movie focuses on how she overcomes these feelings and reveals the relationship with her family, according to IMDb. Okay, so now my negotiated reading of the cinematic texts. So I am focusing my analysis on the representation, as I said. First, I recognize that it's vital to read them as a 3-tiered text. The characters as women, mothers, and exported laborers, hence the diagram earlier on, within the context of our social constructions of gender and then ongoing labor migration. And I situated my inquiries in the 3 stages of their migration experience: their departure, integration to their countries of destination, and finally homecoming. So, so before the OFW phenomenon came to impact the gender roles of men and women, the country Filipino mothers are traditionally confined in the homes. So with the exodus of Filipino mothers, that has changed. Okay, no mothers being left at home already. Mothers have now options. But before, the traditional role is that mother holds the purse-keeping role. But as in this, what good is a purse if it does not have money in it, right? So how can a woman perform the traditional role? So with the migration, okay, women started going out of the country. The very essential question that I asked my analysis is that what convinced Josie and Sarah to leave their homes and work abroad? At first glance, it would be economics, and to prove that their primary motivation is the pool of the other country with better benefits for work and so on and so forth. But actually, what we can imply from this film is that poverty is not just the single push factor for them, but also because their husbands have no longer been able to perform the traditional roles of breadwinning as well. So that's another side and a gender perspective to the theory of migration, I suppose. That it's not just about economic push, but when society shifts, generally, when men also don't handle the pressure of being breadwinners as well. So women take the position, so on and so forth. So that happens when the father-husband is, in the case of the films, not a good provider. So Josie, the one in Anak, her husband initially went to Taiwan as an OFW, but only after 4 months he returned home because he could not overcome his longing for his family. So, but Josie went there and spent a lot of time still longing for her family as well, but did not go home. But she wanted to make sure that her children will have a good education and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, in Sarah's case, her husband was already an OFW in London working as a nurse, or as she was told. And like Josie, Sarah had a decent job as an elementary teacher prior to being a caregiver in London, and in fact was a candidate for promotion in her department. With just one child to raise, and given the fact that both had stable sources of income, there was really no pressing need for Sarah to be a caregiver, though she was convinced she could have a better income abroad. It was entirely her husband's idea for her to resign from her job and join him there because the husband was fired. So he lured actually Sarah to go there so that she could take over the role of the breadwinning. The lack of agency in these women was indeed evident in that Josie only opted to leave because her husband was incapable and unwilling to go the distance provided for the family, and Sarah abandoned her personal career growth in the Philippines mainly because she wanted to support her husband's dream for the family to relocate to London. Now, shifting my attention to Josie and Sarah's husbands, I also observed that the rigid imposition of the breadwinning role on men can prove to be delimiting. To say that men are essentially built as providers is already evoking a myth. I say it is delimiting because obviously in the case of the two husbands, not all men can withstand being away from their families. At least that's how the movies portray them, as opposed to the traditional representation of men. For instance, war movies depicting strong and emotional cavaliers leaving their homes to defend their country. So as a result, Josie and Sarah suffered from the emotional insecurities of their husbands. But instead of correcting their men, they stood as the typecast of supportive wives created by patriarchal imaginations. Sociologist Randy David explains that most Filipino women negotiate the terms of their subjection within their family. They realize that the world is unfair. It is conferred upon men the right to the rulers of their families. But even when their husbands show themselves to be unfit to rule, they somehow feel obliged to maintain that fiction of their men's supremacy while they take on the daily functions of providing for managing and keeping the family together. Indeed, women go through painful coming to terms with becoming absentee mothers and migrant workers, abandoning their children and loved ones. So, in a defining moment, Sarah took his son to a flea market to buy herself a coat for the cold. She took an opportunity to explain to the kid their family's predicament and told him about their future plans. She promised to come back for her son and take him to London to be ultimately reunited with her. So, I want you to wear them when I come back to you, says Sarah. And then Josie bids farewell to her family, and she tells her daughters that she wants them to write letters regularly to them. The films portray that what we technically call as just disintegration and departure from a home country. The film portrays the departure as a sacrifice for women because emotionally they have to be away from them. Now, if we recall the second stage of migration, which is them integration into the countries, mothers continue to, as like what Professor Rosella said, mothers continue to mother from a distance. So they try their best to communication, to connect with their children, and sometimes even commodify love in terms of by means of sending gifts, money, toys, just so their children can make them feel that they still love them. And this is the only way that the mothers can bridge and still show their children that they can commodify, they still love them, but in a sense commodify because they buy things, and then they represent love through material things. But on the other side, in the host countries, they take care of the children of their families, of their host families, like they are their own. So maybe you can just ask questions later on. But the conclusions that I want to make for the presentation is that overall, the mainstream media representation of the OFW mothers is a representation of crisis of identity and worth. And like maybe men who travel and who migrate and come home being celebrated, then they are not being celebrated here. They are always represented as casualty of maybe the neoliberalism and global capitalism of the world. And the dominant discourse evades policy issues. There is no, they don't tackle the overall, situation in the Philippines where the government is not doing anything to make sure that the domestic income is sufficient so that mothers don't have to leave, or whoever, they don't have to leave the country. And cinema is still aside for the continuing struggle to create meaning. So we can still always question even the representation of this gender. So, thank you.
Thank you.